I'd always thought I'd know what to expect when my daughter hit her teenage years, but something about her 15th birthday changed everything. It wasn't just in the way she carried herself, or the new silence she seemed wrapped in. It was the house, as if it knew she was entering a time that held secrets. Old family traditions I barely remembered started pressing in, reminders of our family's rituals creeping into my mind at the strangest times. I didn't want to believe it was real. But then the letter came. The letter arrived on the morning of Emma's 15th birthday, buried beneath a stack of mail and glossy ads. I almost didn't see it. Its weight felt different, though. A thin envelope, the kind that shouldn't demand attention but does anyway, like a whisper in the back of your mind. I noticed my name, written in looping, careful handwriting that I hadn't seen since my mother's funeral a decade ago. The sight of it made me freeze. The letters tilted slightly to the left, the way they always had when she wrote birthday cards or grocery lists. My first instinct was to laugh it off, but that laugh never came. My mother had been dead for years, yet here was her handwriting, as deliberate and clear as if she'd written it yesterday. Emma bounded into the kitchen then, her cheeks flushed with excitement, her hair still messy from sleep. "Pancakes?" she asked, her voice bright and sweet, still so young despite how quickly she was growing. I folded the letter into the pocket of my robe, trying to push the strangeness away. "Of course," I said, brushing her hair back absently. "Birthday pancakes coming up." But the letter weighed heavy against my leg all morning. It lingered through the laughter at breakfast, through Emma tearing into her presents with delight. Finally, once she was distracted with her friends in the backyard, I slipped away to read it. The paper was thick and old, slightly yellowed, with a faint scent of cedar. As I unfolded it, a sharp tang of something metallic hit my nose, making my stomach twist. The note was short but precise. "For your daughter's 15th year, there are rules you must follow every night until her 16th birthday. 1. Once the sun sets, she must not leave the house until sunrise. 2. Cover every mirror in her room after dusk. 3. Do not enter her room after midnight. 4. At exactly midnight, give her a glass of salted water to drink. She must drink it all. 5. She will hear voices calling her name. Do not let her respond. 6. And remember, the hardest rule of all, do not tell her why. Failing even one rule will have consequences. Follow them exactly as I did for you." It was signed simply, Mom. I stared at the words until they blurred together. My mother had been strict, too strict, but she wasn't cruel. She wasn't one to scare me for the sake of it. And yet, here it was. A set of rules, written in her unmistakable handwriting, commanding me to protect my daughter in ways that made no sense. I thought about throwing it away, but a part of me couldn't. Not because I believed it, of course. That would be ridiculous. But because I couldn't shake the feeling that ignoring it would mean something worse than believing it. I'd never been one for superstition, but when it comes to your child, even the ridiculous starts to feel like insurance. The day passed in a blur of party hats, laughter, and frosting-smudged faces. Emma was radiant, glowing in the way only children on their birthdays do. Her friends ran through the house, their voices high-pitched and wild, filling every corner with joy. But as the sun began to sink, I felt that joy thinning. The light outside turned to amber, then faded to a pale gray. Emma's friends started trickling home, one by one, until it was just the two of us in the quiet of the house. After dinner, I lingered in the hallway outside her room, the note crumpled in my fist. The mirror beside her dresser caught my eye. It had always been harmless, Just a second-hand standing mirror with an ornate frame I'd picked up at a yard sale. But tonight, it seemed different. The dark wood carving, once intricate and quaint, now looked severe, the curves curling like tendrils frozen in motion. Its surface gleamed with a sharp, unnatural clarity, reflecting the room in distorted angles. It felt almost alive, as though something inside it were watching. I grabbed a dark scarf from her laundry basket and draped it over the mirror. It was stupid, childish even, but the sight of it made me feel steadier, as if I'd put something dangerous to sleep. "Why are you covering that?" Emma asked from the doorway, her voice light but curious. I turned quickly, the scarf still in my hand. "Just thought it might help you sleep better. You don't need to see yourself dreaming, right?" She tilted her head, clearly unconvinced but not bothered enough to question me further. "Whatever you say, Mom," she said with a shrug, and climbed into bed. I tucked her in, brushing her hair back the way I used to when she was little. She was growing so fast, her face thinner, her cheekbones sharper. I wanted to hold on to this moment, to freeze her just as she was, safe and sweet and mine. "Good night, baby," I said, my voice softer than I'd meant it to be. "Good night," she replied, her eyes already drifting shut. At midnight, I crept back into her room, the glass of salted water trembling in my hands. She was asleep, her breathing slow and steady, her face peaceful in the pale glow of the moonlight that filtered through the curtains. I hesitated at the edge of her bed, the weight of the letter pressing heavily against my mind. The rules had been clear. She had to drink it. All of it. I couldn't let her sleep through it. The thought of waking her, of pulling her from the comfort of her dreams, twisted something sharp and cold in my chest. But the words of the letter rang in my ears like a command. I reached down and gently shook her shoulder. "Emma," I whispered, trying to keep my voice soft. "Wake up, baby." She stirred, her eyes fluttering open, groggy and confused. "What is it, Mom?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "I need you to drink this," I said, holding the glass out to her. "Just a sip, okay? It's important." She brought the glass to her lips, taking one hesitant sip before pulling it away with a grimace. "Why do I have to drink this, Mom? It's disgusting." "I know," I said, forcing a smile, "but it'll help you sleep. Just for a little while until you're 16. She sighed, sitting up reluctantly, and took the glass from my hands. She drank slowly, her face scrunching with every swallow, but she didn't stop until it was empty. When she handed the glass back to me, her eyes lingered on mine. "Why are we doing this?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost pleading. "What's it for?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. "It's just something your grandmother used to do for me," I lied. "It's tradition." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded, lying back against her pillow with a small, resigned sigh. "Okay. Good night, Mom." "Good night," I whispered, backing out of the room and shutting the door behind me. My hand shook as I set the empty glass on the kitchen counter, my thoughts racing. I had followed the rules tonight, but each time, it felt harder to push back the questions, the doubt, the creeping sense that I didn't fully understand what I was protecting her from, or whether I could protect her at all. I couldn't sleep after that. The house was too quiet, the air unnervingly still. Every creak of the floorboards, every murmur of the wind felt like it carried a presence, something watchful, something waiting. I told myself it was just my nerves, that I was overreacting to a strange and harmless note from a woman who had been gone for years. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next morning, Emma was her usual self, bright, talkative, full of energy. She didn't mention the scarf on her mirror, or the glass of water, or the way I'd lingered in her doorway, watching her longer than I should have. For a moment, I thought maybe it really had been nothing, just a strange, unsettling prank from my own past, dredged up by grief. But as I gathered the sheets from her bed, my hand brushed against something cold and damp beneath her pillow. I pulled it out, a crumpled, sodden piece of fabric, crusted with salt. My scarf. And then, faintly, just for a moment, I thought I heard something. Soft, low, like a voice. Calling her name. The following night felt heavier, as though the house itself were watching. Emma seemed oblivious as the evening crept in, her chatter filling the air like birdsong, but it felt wrong, off somehow. I went through the motions, cooking dinner, washing dishes, folding laundry, but my eyes kept drifting to her, scanning her for any sign of change. She caught me staring once. "Mom, what's up with you? You've been weird since my birthday." I forced a laugh. "Weird how?" She tilted her head, her brow furrowing. "I don't know. You're just jumpy. And why's my mirror covered? Did you mess with my room while I was at school?" The lie came too easily. "Just cleaning. Thought it might be nice to keep things fresh." I hated how thin my voice sounded, how obvious it felt. She shrugged and let it go, but the question lingered in her expression. I knew her well enough to see it. Curiosity, growing sharper, keener. I couldn't let her tug at the thread. If she pulled too hard, everything might unravel. That night, the rituals began to suffocate me. I covered her mirror as the sun dipped below the horizon, smoothing the fabric until it lay flat and secure. It looked harmless enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was pressing against the other side, waiting for me to slip up. At midnight, I prepared the salted water, my fingers trembling as I stirred the crystals into the glass. The water swirled thick and cloudy, the salt refusing to dissolve completely. I could almost feel its bitterness on my tongue, the brine curling in the back of my throat. The weight of the glass felt heavier than it should have as I carried it to her room. Emma was awake when I entered, sitting up in bed with her knees pulled to her chest. She looked at me with wide, questioning eyes, her face half lit by the dim glow of the bedside lamp. "Why do I have to drink this every night?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "It's just a tradition," I said, keeping my tone light. "Something your grandmother used to do for me, like a good luck charm." She wrinkled her nose. "It tastes awful." "I know," I said, setting the glass on her nightstand. "But it's important. Trust me." Her eyes lingered on mine, searching for something, some explanation I couldn't give. After a moment, she sighed and took the glass, drinking slowly, her face contorting with each swallow. When she handed it back to me, it was empty, but her expression was one of quiet defiance. "You're being weird," she said, settling back into her pillows. "I don't like it." I brushed her hair from her forehead, ignoring the sting of her words. "Good night, baby." She didn't respond, her eyes already closing as I backed out of the room. The house felt colder that night, the silence sharper. I tried to distract myself with a book, then a glass of wine, but my focus kept slipping, my thoughts circling back to her room. I imagined her lying there, alone in the dark, the mirror covered but still present, its surface gleaming beneath the cloth. I was halfway to sleep when the noise began, a faint, rhythmic creak that carried through the house. At first, I thought it was just the pipes, the old house settling in the cool night air. But as I listened, it grew louder, more deliberate, like footsteps pacing back and forth. I bolted upright, my heart racing. The sound was coming from Emma's room. The rules flashed in my mind. I wasn't supposed to go in. No one was. But the sound didn't stop. It only grew louder, more insistent. My hands trembled as I pulled myself out of bed, stepping carefully into the hallway. Her door loomed ahead, the faint light from beneath it flickering like a heartbeat. I pressed my ear against the wood, straining to hear. "Emma?" I called softly, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. I waited, my breath caught in my chest. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and then faintly, I heard it. A voice, low and soft, just barely audible. It wasn't mine. I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The rules screamed at me to leave, to stay out, but the mother in me couldn't bear it. I gripped the doorknob, my hand slick with sweat, and pushed it open. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight, the air thick and stale. Emma was lying in bed, her face pale and slack, her chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. She looked peaceful, untouched. The pacing sound had stopped, and the voice was gone. And then I saw the mirror. The cloth covering it had slipped, revealing a sliver of glass along the edge. My reflection stared back at me, warped and faint in the dim light. But something was wrong. It wasn't moving. My head tilted slightly, my face twisting in confusion, but the image stayed still, frozen. My legs trembled as I backed away, my eyes locked on the mirror. The reflection tilted its head then, slowly, deliberately, its mouth curling into a small, mocking smile. My stomach lurched as I stumbled toward the door, shutting it behind me. I leaned against the wood, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind reeled, my thoughts fractured. The rules had been clear. Cover the mirrors, stay out of the room after midnight. I'd broken them both, and something new. The next morning, Emma was quiet. She picked at her breakfast, barely eating, her eyes dark with exhaustion. I wanted to ask her if she'd heard anything, if she'd felt the presence in her room, but the words wouldn't come. "Mom," she said finally, breaking the silence. "Why do I feel so tired all the time?" Her voice was small, almost fragile. She looked up at me, her expression worried, vulnerable, and I felt my chest tighten with guilt. "It's just your age," I said quickly. "Teenagers need a lot of rest. You're fine, I promise." She nodded slowly, but her shoulders slumped, and the light in her eyes seemed dimmer than before. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake the unease, but it clung to me like a second skin. The reflection in the mirror haunted me, its frozen smile replaying in my mind. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a product of my exhausted imagination, but the thought didn't stick. By the time night fell, the house felt different. Darker, heavier. Emma was quieter than usual, her movements slower, her gaze distant. I tucked her into bed, smoothing the scarf over the mirror again, my hands shaking. "Good night," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "Good night," I whispered, my chest tight. But as I walked back to my room, I heard it again, that faint, rhythmic creak of footsteps. And this time they didn't stop. The pacing stopped by morning. It always stopped with the sunrise, leaving the house wrapped in an uncanny stillness, as if it were holding its breath. Emma emerged from her room, pale and lethargic, her usual bounce replaced by a slow, measured drag. She sat at the table, pushing a spoon through her cereal. She didn't eat much anymore. Her skin looked thinner, stretched tight over her cheekbones, her eyes ringed with deep shadows. She hadn't smiled in days. "Are you all right, honey?" I asked, sitting down across from her, keeping my voice light. She shrugged without looking at me. "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. I could see it in her dull gaze, the way her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her glass of juice. Something was draining her, pulling her energy into the house itself. I wanted to scream at her, to demand answers she couldn't possibly give, but I stayed silent, because I knew the truth wasn't with her. It was in the mirror. The scarf hadn't stayed in place. Every morning, it was pulled askew or crumpled on the floor, as if someone, or something, had ripped it away. I told myself Emma must have been curious, that she'd peeked in the night, even though she swore she hadn't. But there were other things I couldn't explain. The whispers were louder now, more distinct, threading through the walls of the house like veins. They didn't just call Emma anymore. Sometimes, in the still moments before dawn, I thought I heard my own name, spoken with a dark, familiar intimacy that made my stomach churn. The saltwater ritual began to feel like a mockery. Emma drank it each night, her lips curling in disgust, her eyes meeting mine with a glimmer of defiance. She was starting to resent me. I could feel it in the silence that followed. One night, after she'd drained the glass, she spoke. "What's it for?" she asked, her voice cutting through the stillness. "The water. Why do I have to drink it?" I hesitated, gripping the glass tighter. "It's a tradition. Something your grandmother used to do for me." "You're lying." She wasn't accusing me, just stating it, plain and simple. Her gaze was sharp, her voice calm, and it made me feel like I was shrinking under her scrutiny. "It's not just some old tradition. It's something else. Something bad." I sat down on the edge of her bed, trying to steady my trembling hands. "It's to keep you safe, Emma. That's all." Her lip twitched, but she didn't press further. She lay back against the pillows, staring up at the ceiling, and after a moment, she whispered, "I don't feel safe." The words stayed with me long after I left her room. The next night, I sat at the kitchen table, the letter spread before me like a confession. The rules swam in my vision, their meaning twisting with each reread. The weight of them pressed against my chest, heavy and unbearable. "Follow them exactly as I did for you." The words echoed in my head, and with them came a flood of memories I'd spent years burying. My own 15th birthday, my mother's stern voice, the way she'd refused to explain why I couldn't leave the house after dark, why I had to drink that bitter water every night, why she'd draped every mirror in my room like a corpse. I'd hated her for it. The rituals had felt cruel, meaningless, a strange punishment she couldn't, or wouldn't, justify. And when I'd turned 16, it had all stopped. The mirrors were uncovered, the salt water forgotten, and she'd never spoken of it again. I'd convinced myself it was just one of her eccentricities, a superstition she'd carried from her own childhood. But now, sitting here in the same position she must have been in all those years ago, I understood. The rules weren't superstition. They were survival. Midnight came, and with it, a terrible decision. I hadn't covered Emma's mirror that night. I hadn't salted the water. I told myself I needed answers, that I couldn't protect her from something I didn't understand. But as I stood in the hallway, the silence pressing against me, I realized the truth. I was afraid to face the rules because I'd already broken them too many times. And I knew, deep down, that the house knew it too. When I opened her door, the air felt heavier than usual, thick and damp like the inside of a cave. Emma was sitting up in bed, her back to me, her head tilted slightly. She didn't turn when I entered. "Emma?" My voice cracked in the quiet. She didn't respond, but her shoulders twitched, almost imperceptibly. I took a step closer, my heart hammering in my chest. "I didn't bring the water," I said, my voice trembling. "But we need to talk." Her head turned slowly, unnaturally, until her eyes met mine. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. The darkness in her gaze, the faint swirling shadow beneath her skin. Her lips curled into a small, joyless smile. "They're here," she said, her voice calm, almost conversational. "I let them in." My stomach dropped. What are you talking about?" She tilted her head, her expression serene. "The veil, it's thinner now. They've been waiting for someone to open it, and you helped." "Emma, no." The words came out as a whisper, but it carried all the weight of my denial. "Emma, this isn't you. You don't know what you're saying." Her laugh was soft and hollow, barely a sound. "You should have followed the rules, Mom. You didn't, and now they're free." I took another step back, my legs trembling. "Who's free? Emma, what are you talking about?" But she wasn't looking at me anymore. Her gaze had drifted to the mirror, where the cloth hung loosely, revealing just a sliver of glass. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't hers. Not entirely. The figure in the mirror was darker, taller, its features shifting and contorting with every passing second. I reached for her, desperate to pull her away. But the moment my hand touched her shoulder, she turned to me fully, her face a mask of something ancient and unrecognizable. "They're waiting for you too," she whispered. And then the mirror shattered. The sound of the mirror shattering lingered in the air, sharp and endless, ringing in my ears long after the shards hit the floor. The room felt different now, hollowed out, as though something vast and unseen had stepped inside. Emma didn't move, her body stiff and still, her face turned toward the shattered glass. I stood frozen in the doorway, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The fragments of the mirror glittered in the dim light, reflecting twisted, fragmented versions of the room. But it wasn't just the room I saw. In each shard, shadows moved, long and sinuous, curling at the edges of the broken glass like smoke. "Emma?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Emma, look at me." She turned then, slowly, her movements too fluid, too deliberate. Her eyes met mine, and I saw none of my daughter in them. They were dark and bottomless, swirling with something primal, something hungry. "They're here," she said, her voice low and serene. "You let them in." The word caught in my throat, unspoken, as my mind raced to make sense of her words. She shook her head slowly, her lips curling into a faint, twisted smile. "You broke the rules," she said simply. "You didn't cover the mirrors. You didn't bring the water. You opened the door, Mom. You let them through." I stepped back, my legs trembling, the weight of her words crashing down on me. "Emma, no. This isn't you. You're still my daughter. I can fix this. I can..." Her laughter cut through me, soft and hollow, carrying none of the warmth I'd once known. "It's too late. They've been waiting for this moment for years, and now they have me." I tried to move toward her, to reach for her, but the room shifted around me, the air thickening like molasses. My limbs felt heavy, my movements sluggish, as though the house itself were working against me. The shards of glass on the floor began to pulse, a faint rhythmic glow that matched the pounding of my heart. "You should have listened," Emma said, her voice layered with something deeper, something not her own. "Grandma warned you. She tried to keep you safe, but you didn't understand. None of you ever do." I dropped to my knees, my hands clutching the doorframe for support. "I didn't know," I whispered. "I didn't know that it would take you." Emma tilted her head, her expression almost pitying. "You didn't want to know. That's why the rules existed. To keep you blind, obedient. But you broke them. And now, it's my turn." The room dissolved into chaos. The fragments of the mirror erupted, throwing shards of light and shadow across the walls. Emma's body convulsed, her head snapping back as her limbs twisted in unnatural angles. I screamed her name, clawing my way toward her, but an invisible force held me back, pinning me against the floor. The shadows from the mirror coalesced, taking shape, forming something vast and terrible that loomed over her. It had no face, no features, just a swirling, writhing mass of darkness that pulsed with ancient, unknowable power. Its presence filled the room, pressing against my chest, suffocating me. Emma's voice broke through the roar, small and frightened. "Mom?" I lifted my head, my heart twisting at the sound. For a brief moment, her eyes were clear, wide with fear, her face pale and stricken. She looked at me, her voice wavering. "Mom, help me, please." I sobbed, clawing at the invisible force that kept me pinned. I'm here, Emma. Hold on." But the shadows consumed her before I could reach her. They wrapped around her body, pulling her into the darkness, her screams echoing in my ears. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the room fell silent. Emma was gone. The days after her disappearance passed in a haze, each one bleeding into the next. The house felt emptier than ever, stripped of all warmth, all life. I stayed in her room, sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the broken mirror, waiting for something, anything that might bring her back. But the house offered no answers, only silence. The letter from my mother was still on the kitchen table, its words mocking me, a reminder of the rules I had failed to follow. I read it over and over again, my mind spinning with the weight of what I'd lost. I thought about the nights when I'd heard the voices, the whispers calling Emma's name. I thought about the moments I'd dismissed the rules as superstition, too proud, too skeptical to believe in something I couldn't understand. And I thought about my mother, how she must have felt, watching me at Emma's age, following the rules without question, terrified of what would happen if she failed. She'd saved me. She'd kept me safe. And I had failed to do the same for Emma. The whispers came back on the third night after Emma was taken. At first, they were faint, barely audible, threading through the walls like distant echoes. But as the night deepened, they grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they weren't calling her name anymore. They were calling mine. I sat on the floor of her room, staring at the broken mirror, the shards still scattered across the floor. In the dim light, I could see my reflection staring back at me, fragmented and warped, each piece a distorted version of myself. And then, in the corner of one shard, I saw her, Emma. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, her lips moving soundlessly. She reached for me, her hand pressed against the glass, but her expression was wrong, frozen like a mask. I scrambled toward the shard, my hands trembling, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "Emma," I whispered. "I'm here. I'll get you out, I promise." Her lips moved again, but this time I heard her voice, faint and distorted, as though it were coming from far away. "Why didn't you follow the rules?" The words struck me like a knife, sharp and unforgiving. Tears streamed down my face as I reached for the shard, my fingers brushing against its jagged edge. "I'm sorry," I choked out. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to lose you." Her expression didn't change. Her hand remained pressed against the glass, her eyes locked onto mine, empty and endless. And then, slowly, she faded, dissolving into the darkness beyond the shard. The whispers stopped. The house is quiet now. Too quiet. I move through its rooms like a ghost, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me, suffocating me. I see Emma in every corner, every shadow, her absence haunting me more than her presence ever could. The rules weren't just a burden, they were a lifeline, and I had let it slip through my fingers. I am alone now, bound to this house, this curse, waiting for the day the whispers come for me fully. And when they do, I won't fight them. I'll let them take me. Maybe then, I'll find her again.